Medieval Crusaders are not afraid to die. In fact, to them, death is a means to what was promised, because it shows they have fulfilled God's will by fighting the holy war ordained by Him, which gives them absolute salvation. These warriors were shaped into lethal weapons right from childhood, groomed with the skills and discipline needed for survival in battles. Most Crusaders are from noble or knightly families, trained in horsemanship, swordsmanship, and the use of a lance from childhood. As pages and later squires, they served older knights, learning not only martial skills but also the codes of chivalry, loyalty, and religious devotion. Physical endurance was built through hunting, jousting, and wearing armor during training, while discipline came from harsh training. Crusaders are mainly pictured as amateur recruits rushing into war, never to see home again. But that's not entirely correct. Medieval Crusaders are not amateurs. They were trained all their life with the hope of serving their purpose on the battlefield, even though they might not truly see home again. But what made them different is their devotion to the cause. Crusades are mostly a death sentence, and most Crusaders will gladly march into battle with courage instead of fear, which is why they are formidable. They marched not as mere soldiers, nor as wandering pilgrims, but as the embodiment of an idea, that the will of God and the force of arms were bound together in a single, unbroken chain. In their world, there was no dividing line between altar and battleground, between prayer and battle plan. The banner of the cross was at once a holy emblem and a rallying point for armies, its flutter in the wind both a proclamation of faith and a declaration of political intent. When a crusader rode into the field, he carried the authority of his Lord, the blessing of his church, and the hopes of a Christendom that saw the fate of nations and the fate of souls as one and the same. Forget about the Nollywood movies of soldiers charging into battle like mindless zombies. Medieval crusaders like to play the game of numbers, which is a psychological strategy to intimidate their opponents. When charging into battle, they make sure to raise their banner high in fleeting numbers. One person could hold 2 spears attached to 2 banners, multiplying their numbers in distance. At the front, the knights, armored from head to toe, their destriers bred for power, not speed. Behind them march disciplined infantry, spearmen, crossbowmen, and archers. This arrangement was no accident. In open battle, the Crusaders relied on a blend of shock and steadfast defense. Their greatest weapon was the cavalry charge. At the right moment, after the enemy was softened by volleys of arrows and bolts, the knights would lower their lances and surge forward in a tight wedge, the weight of horse and steel smashing into enemy lines like a living battering ram. But they were not reckless. Against nimble foes like the Turks, who relied on horse archers to harass and retreat, Crusaders often fought in tight, defensive formations, shields locked, spears braced, forcing the enemy to come close. They would endure the rain of arrows, waiting for the perfect opening to unleash the cavalry. Crusaders were driven by deep religious conviction. They believed they were fighting a holy war sanctioned by God, with the promise of spiritual rewards. This faith gave them mental resilience in the face of extreme danger, hunger, and disease. They don't care for their own life because the reward is greater. They fight fiercely because they have a divine being backing their action, and at each step into war, they believe God is right with them as the chief commander. An army with such conviction and unshaken faith will defeat any rival, even if it takes 100 years for them to do that. Godfrey of Bouillon, one of the First Crusade's foremost generals, was recorded encouraging his men during the siege of Jerusalem in 1099, saying, "Advance boldly in the name of God. For today you will gain for yourselves a homeland in this city or an eternal dwelling in heaven." This speech not only helped win the battle but created a superficial belief in the Crusaders that they were not fighting or dying for earthly reasons but for everlasting victory. Even if they lost the battle, they felt pleased to have carried out God's instruction, which is to advance boldly and gain a home in heaven. Medieval Crusaders were different in every way because of their endurance and toughness. Fighting in the Middle East means leaving their comfort zone to endure scorching heat and walk miles without water. Their armor is already an oven, yet they keep moving, always on alert for any surprise attack. This is not something that could be taught or imposed on someone. The men at the front muttered prayers under their breath, not to cool the air, but to cool their will into something unbreakable. Sometimes they marched for weeks, through barren plains where no shade offered mercy, and the nights brought biting cold that gnawed at their bones. Armor was heavy, but they wore it as if it were a second skin. The weight was no longer a burden, only part of them. Hunger hollowed their faces, yet no one broke rank. When blisters split beneath their feet, they bound them in cloth and kept walking. The enemy had tried to harry them, arrows hissing from distant ridges, but each time they closed ranks and pressed on. To falter was to invite fear, to endure was to win ground. In these marches they learned that victory was not only won in the clash of swords, but in the silent defiance of exhaustion, in the stubborn will to place one foot before the other. And as the sun sank red on the horizon, the Crusaders' bodies were worn out but their spirit unbent, ready to face another battle as God commands. Medieval Crusaders are not only firm believers in faith, but they were also innovators. Fighting with the Muslims and Byzantines changed conventional warfare. With the opposition using new tools and weapons, the Crusaders had to adapt, create a defense mechanism, and level the playing field. Their Muslim opponents, particularly the Turks, favored mobile warfare with swift cavalry and hit-and-run attacks using horse archers. Over time, Crusaders learned to fight defensively in tight infantry formations to counter harassment, only unleashing cavalry at opportune moments. They borrowed and improved siege technologies such as trebuchets, mangonels, and sapping tunnels. Contact with Byzantines and local artisans introduced them to Greek fire, better fortification designs, and advanced shipbuilding for coastal supply lines. The Crusaders who came as strangers left as warriors remade, hardened not only by steel but by the ability to change. In the Holy Land, adaptability was not a choice, it was survival, and those who survived became something far greater than the soldiers who first stepped ashore. A historical record of the most fierce crusade encounter happened in Antioch, where men became gods, disregarding their own lives and carving their names into the historical record. Beneath the blistering sun and the looming shadow of Antioch's massive walls, the Crusaders stood, worn from months of starvation, disease, and relentless attacks, yet unyielding in their purpose. What set them apart from the countless armed hosts of history was not simply their fervor, but the fusion of faith and ferocity that drove them beyond the limits of endurance. For months they endured privations that would have shattered lesser armies. When they ran out of food for days, they resorted to consuming horses for food. Armor rusted from constant exposure, and the ranks thinned by pestilence. They turned adversity into discipline, forging alliances with discontented locals and intercepting caravans meant for the city, choking Antioch into submission. When the moment of assault finally came, it was not brute numbers that carried them forward, but ingenuity and audacity. Under the cover of darkness, they exploited the betrayal of an Armenian guard within the city, scaling the walls in small, disciplined groups, each man knowing his place in the perilous plan. Unlike the ponderous armies of old, they fought with a cohesion born of shared ordeal, knights and footmen moving as one, covering each other's advance, securing breaches before the enemy could respond. Their swords were not merely weapons but symbols, each stroke driven by the conviction that they fought for something eternal, a belief that magnified their courage and steadied their hands in the chaos. When the city fell, their trial was not yet over. A massive relief army, vastly superior in numbers, swept in to reclaim Antioch, trapping the Crusaders within the very walls they had just conquered. Most forces in history, exhausted and besieged anew, would have surrendered or attempted a desperate flight. The Crusaders chose neither. They organized, rallied, and rode out in formation, banners aloft, their battered armor gleaming defiantly in the sun. Charging into the enemy lines, they fought not as a rabble clinging to life, but as a disciplined engine of destruction, breaking through with precision strikes that shattered the morale of the larger host. It was this combination of endurance under hardship, tactical adaptability, and a unity of purpose, hardened by shared faith, that set the Crusaders at Antioch apart from any army before or since, transforming an inevitable disaster into one of the most remarkable reversals in medieval warfare. These men were not just warriors in battle, they were true believers, loyalists, innovators, and brothers in battle of faith.